When we talk about Iran, the conversation often splits into two extremes: diplomacy on one side and military force on the other. But what this crisis actually shows is that neither of those frameworks fully capture what is happening today. We are looking at a situation where military strikes have not removed capability and diplomacy has struggled to produce durable trust or verification. So the question is no longer just what tools are available, but how effective they really are under current conditions of escalation and mistrust. To unpack this, I'm joined by Darya Dolzikova, a research fellow at RUSI, where she works on nuclear risk, non-proliferation, and escalation dynamics, with a focus on how states interpret and manage nuclear-related threats. Darya, welcome to the nuclear table.
Thanks for having me.
We tend to treat military strikes on nuclear infrastructure as a way of solving the problem, but historically they seem to delay programs rather than eliminate them. So, in cases like Iran, what does military action actually achieve in counterproliferation, and where does it hit its limits?
Yeah, so the use of military force as a counterproliferation tool is not necessarily new. There have been other historic instances where states that were concerned by another state's and adversary's nuclear program have resorted to military means to try to address that concern. So, for instance, I think the kind of the most well-known cases of that are the Israeli attacks on the nuclear facilities, the Iraqi nuclear facilities at Al Tuwaitha, so the Ozark reactors in Iraq, the Israeli attacks on the Al Kibar nuclear reactor in Syria. As we found out later, that it was a nuclear reactor that was being constructed. So this isn't the first time that states have resorted to the use of military force for counterproliferation efforts. And again, even those two instances were not historic instances were not the only ones. But there are limitations to the use of military force as a counterproliferation strategy, and there are limitations to its effectiveness. Um, the effectiveness of the use of military force for counterproliferation is really dependent on a number of different factors. And I would say, I think, of greatest relevance to the Iranian case, and perhaps comparing it to past historical cases, is the extent of the program, both geographically and in the number of facilities, but also how entrenched the nuclear program and nuclear knowledge is in the country of concern. So, in this case, Iran. So, again, if we look at historical cases, whether that be the Ozark reactors in Iraq or the Al Kibar facility in Syria that were targeted by the Israelis, in both those instances, the programs were relatively speaking, and in Syria more so than in Iraq, but they were relatively speaking quite limited programs. Again, both in terms of kind of geographic scope. So in the case of Iraq, there were a number of various facilities, but kind of the key one that was of concern was again the Ozark reactors at Al Tuwaitha, and then in the case of Syria, it was really just the Al Kibar facility, as far as we know, that was again of main concern. So the use of military force in that instance was again relatively effective because there's a limited number of facilities that you had to target. At the same time, those programs had in large part been the result of imported expertise, right? So in the case of Iraq, it was the French that were building the Ozark reactors. In the case of Syria and the Al Kibar reactor, that was being constructed by the North Koreans, right? So this is expertise that the countries had imported. Um, so once those facilities were destroyed, it was that much harder domestically for the targeted states to actually reconstruct those programs. So military force again can set a program back quite significantly, but it has its limitations, even in instances when a program is imported from abroad, when it's not domestic expertise, and when it's quite limited in scope. So when we look at the Iranian case, we really have, in terms of kind of the ease or the effectiveness of the use of military force for counterproliferation purposes, we have in the case of Iran really the hardest challenge of all. Right, this is a program that has been immensely dispersed, right? So there's dozens of facilities across the country that are relevant to the nuclear program in Iran. Many of those facilities have been hardened. They're underground. They have active and passive defenses around them, military defenses around them. Um, and additionally, and most importantly, I would argue, is the fact that this program is decades old, right? So the program goes back to really the 1950s. So there's really entrenched nuclear expertise in the country. So while the material or the practical challenges of targeting even hardened facilities and great numbers of facilities can technically be overcome, and we've seen the U.S. use very heavy munitions, bunker buster bombs, as we would call them, to target some of those particularly hardened underground facilities. What's a lot harder to wipe out is that entrenched, long established expertise that exists in the country that can be used to eventually rebuild the program. Obviously, we've seen that the US strikes, both in June and more recently in kind of since the end of February, have done quite significant damage to the program and seem to have set it back significantly. What it hasn't done is eliminate the program fully. It's not eliminated the expertise that exists in the country. And most importantly, we don't know what it's done to Iran's strategic calculations. So when we look at the use of military force as a counterproliferation tactic, we sort of have to consider the material aspects, or the expertise alongside the political decision making, right? And the issue with military force is that while it might degrade that first part of the equation, the material, the actual program, the material parts of it, so the facilities, the fissile material, you can even kill scientists, as we've seen the Israelis do and the Americans do. But you have to ask yourself, what does it do to that second part of the equation? When when the US carries out a military operation as expansive as it has in the case of Iran over the last few months, when it targets its senior leadership, when it threatens to wipe the Iranian civilization off the face of the earth, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that second half of the equation, the strategic decision making for the Iranians, has shifted in the exact opposite direction of where it needs to go. That Iran is now becoming increasingly convinced that the only thing that will prevent such large scale military action against it in the future and against its leadership in the future will be to move towards a nuclear weapon. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the direction that it's gone in.
What also comes through from your answer is that military action is only one part of a much larger counter-proliferation toolkit. I've been researching counter-proliferation measures quite extensively while working on a book based on my PhD research on North Korea, particularly sanctions and diplomacy. And what stands out is that neither ultimately prevented Pyongyang from acquiring nuclear weapons. So, when sanctions, diplomacy, and other peaceful counterproliferation measures fail to stop proliferation, what does that tell us about the limits of counterproliferation itself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you're taking me back a few years because I had spent quite a few years working on counterproliferation financing and precisely the issues that you raise with regard to North Korea and Iran as well, and looking at the effectiveness of sanctions and economic constraints that they would need to develop or expand their nuclear weapons programs. And sanctions definitely have their limitations as well. As your listeners, I'm sure, will be aware, the North Koreans have become exceptionally adept at circumventing sanctions. The Iranians have as well. There's also limits to how much of an impact economic pressure will have on a state that is, first of all, authoritarian, in particular in the case of North Korea. There's also a limit to how much economic pressure will be able to influence a government's decision making, particularly when we're dealing with authoritarian states who, frankly, whose main concern is not necessarily the well-being of the population, on whom a lot of times the effects of economic pressure actually fall first and foremost. So you're right. So sanctions are limited in their effectiveness as a counterproliferation tool as well. Diplomacy is also limited in its effectiveness as a counterproliferation tool. You know, we've been engaging with the Iranians in diplomacy for decades. With the North Koreans, there are multiple attempts, including by the Trump administration, to try to resolve the proliferation concerns diplomatically. Um, so there's no panacea. None of these things are going to be, you know, the magic potion, if you will, that will solve that will prevent a country from developing nuclear weapons. And when we're looking at counterproliferation, there are two aspects that we really need to be tackling. There's the material aspect, right? So the practicalities, the centrifuges, the uranium, the aluminium that's used in the centrifuges, like the actual materials and the technology that states need to move their nuclear program forward, and looking at a way to either eliminate those materials or to prevent the state from acquiring to the best extent that we can. And then there's a second part of the equation, which is the strategic calculation, right? So convincing the state that we're dealing with that they are better off not pursuing a nuclear weapon, that their security will be better off by not pursuing a nuclear weapon than pursuing it. That first half of the equation is actually, relatively speaking, kind of the more straightforward one to resolve. And for that, again, I go back to, you could use military force to eliminate some of those materials. You can use sanctions and export controls and interdictions, as we've been doing with the North Koreans for some time, to prevent the acquisition of the materials that they need to develop nuclear weapons. And again, things fall through. And states don't develop nuclear weapons just for the fun of it. They advance their nuclear programs, develop hedging capabilities or nuclear weapons capabilities, because they have security concerns that they think that either hedging or full out nuclear weapons capability will resolve. In the case of Iran, it that hedging capability, that nuclear hedging capability, was just one piece of the puzzle. We see the Iranians developing advanced missile capabilities. We've seen the Iranians develop expansive networks in the regions of proxies and allies, so that they can kind of export their defense outside of their borders, and engage in, you know, what we conceive of as being destabilizing activity in the region, what they probably conceive of as being sort of their efforts at defending their security and their interests in the region. We've seen them develop UAV capabilities, etc. So when we're looking at convincing a state that giving up its nuclear program, whether it be hedging capability or full out nuclear weapons capability, is in their interest, you know, that that needs to consider all of these other strategic considerations, right? And strategic concerns that a state has. And that's a lot harder to address than just saying, well, we'll cap the number of centrifuges you can have, or we'll cap the amount of fissile material you can produce or stockpile, because oftentimes it requires the buy-in of other stakeholders. So in Iran's case, you know, there's this trade-off between, do we just focus negotiations on the nuclear aspect, or do we expand negotiations more broadly to deal with Iran's missile capabilities, to deal with Iran's other regional activities? Do we bring in other actors to the table, right? So the Gulf states have for a long time been asking to sit at the negotiating table, and the extent to which they were adamant about that has sort of shifted over the years. But because the nuclear aspect, the nuclear program, is a symptom, right, of a much more complicated regional security dynamic, which again, is a lot harder to address than just addressing centrifuge numbers or fissile material.
There is a lot of language right now about Iran being close to a nuclear weapon, but that concept often blurs together very different things: material capability, technical readiness, and political decision making. So, when we say close, what are we actually measuring and what gets misunderstood?
Iran is 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon, or has been 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon for the last 10 years. So when we look at how close Iran is to developing a nuclear weapon, there are three aspects that I tend to look at. So there's the fissile material, so that's the uranium in Iran's case that would go inside of a nuclear weapon. Um, so we need to look at kind of how close they are in terms of the amount of enriched uranium they have, the levels to which they're enriching. Then the second aspect is the sort of the actual weaponization, so the development of the nuclear weapon. And related to that, we can include in there kind of the mating of the weapon to an appropriate missile that can actually deliver it. And then there's a third aspect, which is the political decision to actually move towards weaponization. So on the first aspect, the fissile material, um, the latest or the most up to date figures that we really have are from early June of last year, of 2025, so before the strikes, early June or late May, when the IAEA last had access to the relevant facilities in Iran. And even then, some of the numbers that the IAEA has reported, had reported in its last report, were estimates, because Iran had significantly decreased IAEA access over the years to its program, and has cut it off completely since the June strikes. But if we look at that Iran's fissile material, and the last information that we have on Iran's fissile material stocks, the estimate is that Iran had enough enriched uranium to produce, um, I think the estimate was 5 nuclear warheads within, in under a week, and then more after that. They had enough uranium enriched to 60% to produce about 10 nuclear warheads. When we look at uranium enrichment levels, 20% and above is considered highly enriched uranium. Anything below that is low enriched uranium. Normally, when we look at enrichment for an energy program, nuclear reactors take fuel that's enriched to about 3 to 5%. High enriched uranium starts at about 20%. There are some research reactors that take highly enriched uranium as well. When we're looking at weapons grade uranium, we're usually looking at about 90% enrichment. And Iran had been stockpiling enriched uranium at various levels, but up to and including 60% enriched uranium. So they had sufficient stocks of 60% enriched uranium. It's not quite weapons grade, but getting close for, like I said, about 10 nuclear warheads. So when it comes to the fissile material stocks, they were quite significant, hence the very serious and very real proliferation concerns that the Iranian program posed. If we move to the second component, the actual weaponization, that's where it becomes a little bit less clear on what activities Iran was actually engaging in, and how close they would have been to actually being able to take that enriched uranium, and then configure it into an actual nuclear warhead. So we know from US intelligence reports that Iran had been engaging in what the US intelligence community had characterized as activities that would be useful to weaponization had Iran decided to weaponize. We know that they were doing R&D with uranium metal, and you would need to take uranium, which is in gas form when it's being enriched, and turn it into metal to make the core of a nuclear weapon. Historically, they had engaged in a systematic program that was relevant to weaponization. So they had done experiments with explosives, with modeling. So we know that they were engaging in activities that would have been relevant to weaponization, although we in the public domain don't have a full sense of how close they would have been to actually being able to produce nuclear war. The estimate had been, again, prior to June, that Iran was kind of anywhere between 6 to 18 months from being able to, if decided to, actually develop a nuclear warhead. But again, that's very rough and kind of going off of what information we have publicly. And then there's that third aspect, which is the political decision to actually move towards weaponization. And that's where the US's own intelligence community, as of early 2025, had assessed that Iran had not made the decision to actually move towards weaponization. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, seems to be of a similar opinion that Iran had not made that decision. There were some reports back in the summer from the Israelis that something in their assessment of the Iranian nuclear program had changed. Perhaps that had something to do with that decision making, that political decision to move towards weaponization. We don't actually know what it was, and the Israelis have sort of they'd mentioned it, or it was reported back in the summer, I believe, and then kind of hasn't come up since. So I don't know what that was about precisely, but the overwhelming evidence again of what we have publicly was that Iran had not actually made that final decision to weaponize. And that's important because, as I've said, the Iranians have had this program for decades. Granted, it hasn't been as advanced as it had gotten to be by before the June strikes last year. But it seemed that they were pursuing not necessarily a policy of moving quickly towards weaponization, but that Tehran was pursuing more so a policy of hedging. So they were developing these various aspects of their program that would be relevant to producing a nuclear weapon fairly quickly if they decided to do so. But it sort of seemed like they were happy kind of sitting on the fence and using this sort of latent ability, this hedging capability, as a sufficient deterrent. So, sort of threatening both implicitly and eventually explicitly that, hey, we have everything we need. We can decide to move towards a nuclear weapon, but they hadn't done that. Um, and again, the question that then comes up for me is what has the last year and the last 2 months in particular, what has that done to that third aspect, to that decision making around, is a hedging capability enough, or do we actually need to move towards weaponization?
One of the more important dynamics here is that a state doesn't need to cross the threshold to change the strategic balance. Latency itself can matter. Iran has operated in that space for years between capability and restraint. How should we think about nuclear latency? Is the real issue actual weaponization or the ability to remain indefinitely at the threshold?
Well, I think what the last year has shown is that the hedging strategy hasn't really worked for Iran. And I think it's proven the case that a hedging capability is not a nuclear weapons capability, it's not a nuclear deterrent, and that there is still a difference between the two. And I would argue, and maybe this sort of adds on to what we were talking about earlier, that even developing a single nuclear warhead, or getting really close to developing a handful of nuclear warheads, is in and of itself not the same as a nuclear deterrent, because that would still not be a survivable nuclear deterrent, a single warhead or even a handful of warheads. Um, so I think it's demonstrated quite clearly to Iran and to others that, who might be thinking about a potential proliferation pathway for themselves, that a hedging capability might not actually be sufficient to deter what we've seen happening to Iran over the last 2 months, but over the last year. And that might drive other states to two possible conclusions. One of them being that if you're going to develop a nuclear or a weaponizable nuclear program, you better do it in secret, you better do it quick, and you better be ready to go all the way, and not sit on the threshold. Or the other way of looking at it is that, maybe this will be a deterrent for other states, from moving towards, or developing a program that is of proliferation concern. I think for the Iranians, it's a good question whether or not they miscalculated the Israeli and the US red lines. Potentially, but I think what they fundamentally miscalculated on was, yeah, the deterrent value of a threshold capability and the resolve of the United States in particular, and the Trump administration in particular, to use military action to address it. I don't think there's ever any question about, the Israelis' willingness to use military force to resolve the Iranian nuclear question. Um, but Israel will have been for a long time limited by its own capabilities. It didn't have the aircraft to deliver, the types of munitions that had been necessary to penetrate Iran's, uh, deepest buried facilities. There was also concern over how Iran might respond, whether these would be able to absorb, an Iranian response, to large scale military action against its nuclear infrastructure. So I think, yeah, what the Iranians, probably what Tehran miscalculated was U.S. resolve, right? And once the U.S. resolve and the U.S. willingness was there to contribute to an Israeli operation, like, that's when I think the calculus would have changed for the Israelis as well. And, it's that willingness of the U.S. to backstop with its own capabilities, that made that the action in June and this larger war now, fundamentally possible for the Israelis.
Even if there is no immediate proliferation cascade, what seems to be shifting is how regional actors interpret vulnerability and deterrence. Those perceptions don't always produce immediate action, but they do reshape long term strategy. What are other states in the region actually learning from this moment?
I don't think there's an imminent, uh, threat of, a proliferation cascade in the Middle East, largely because there's just the other states just don't have the capabilities. Like, there's no, advanced civilian nuclear programs in the region with the necessary components to actually pose a real proliferation threat. Having said that, if any country was to be of concern, it would be Saudi Arabia. The Saudi leadership has come out previously and said that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, then we will have to get one as well. So it'll be interesting to see what the Saudi calculation is with regards to what the military action against Iran might have done to Iranian, strategic calculations, and whether they think that Iran is more or less likely to move towards a nuclear weapon at this point. Um, there's there was a recent, agreement signed between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia on civil nuclear cooperation, and there's a debate now over whether that should include enrichment technology as well, and whether Saudi Arabia should be required to conclude an additional protocol with the International Atomic Energy Agency in addition to its comprehensive safeguards agreement. So that additional protocol would allow the IAEA additional access, across, Saudi Arabia's nuclear facilities. And then, as I mentioned, there's this question of whether or not, Saudi Arabia should receive enrichment technology from the US. I and others have argued strongly against that. There's plenty of countries that have civil nuclear programs without having domestic enrichment capabilities. They get their nuclear fuel shipped in from elsewhere. And I think it would, on the one hand side, be a little bit of a double standard for us to say to the Iranians, you can't have enrichment, or we have to cap your enrichment because your enrichment activities pose a proliferation concern. But then send enrichment capabilities to Saudi Arabia, which has, as I said, whose leadership has said that they would look to get a nuclear weapon if Iran would have one. So there's that debate going on. So I think if the most likely candidate depending on how we handle this question of whether or not to send enrichment technology to Saudi Arabia would be Saudi Arabia. But even there, like I said, neither the Saudis nor anyone else in the region really poses, to me, an eminent proliferation concern. But I think it's worth looking at what countries more broadly, not just in the region, are learning from Iran's experience, um, but also Ukraine's experience. There's we don't have time to go into it now, and I know you had Mariana on your podcast before talking about um, Ukraine's decision to remove Soviet nuclear weapons from its territory, but some states might be taking the lesson that if you get rid of nuclear weapons, or the ability to develop nuclear weapons, that you are more likely to be at risk, and that actually it's best to retain those capabilities. Or to, on the flip side, you look at North Korea, which has decided to, or which has been able to retain its nuclear weapons capabilities, and has not suffered military attack the same way that the Iranians have suffered military aggression, having not developed nuclear weapons but having sat at that threshold. It raises a question for me of what lessons are other states taking away from this. I'm hoping that there's a recognition among other states, be it in the Middle East or elsewhere, that this isn't a simple thing, that if they started developing proliferation programs of proliferation concern, they will be caught out. They will be called out for it, and they might risk military action the same way that Iran has.
Another layer here is that some of the facilities targeted were under IAEA safeguards, which complicates assumptions about protection and neutrality. If safeguarded, sites can still be attacked. That raises questions about the credibility of existing norms. So, what does that mean for the future of safeguards as a system of trust and verification?
I wouldn't think so, because you can acquire, as I mentioned in the Saudi case, you can acquire civil nuclear technology, and many states have and do, without it posing a proliferation concern if you are in full compliance with your comprehensive safeguards agreement, if you have an additional protocol concluded with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and if you are not acquiring technology and materials that are not completely necessary for your civilian nuclear program. Um, and Iran was posing an issue across all of these things, right? They were denying access to the International Atomic Energy Agency. They weren't fully transparent with the IAEA on what they were doing. I mean, the way that Iran's nuclear program became of concern initially was that in 2002, it was announced that Iran had these two facilities that it hadn't actually declared to the IAEA, which then raises the question of why were you hiding these facilities? Why weren't you transparent with your full program? Um, Iran was stockpiling material at levels of enrichment and at levels of stocks and quantities that didn't really have an easy civilian explanation. Um, so, as long as states don't do all those things, which is not very hard, there's plenty of states that have civil nuclear programs that nobody has any issue with, then it shouldn't pose a proliferation concern. If a state's not pushing to have enrichment technology on its territory because it's importing nuclear fuel from elsewhere, if it's being fully transparent with the agency and is in good standing with the IAEA, I don't see why it would pose any proliferation concern at all. Um, Iran has a credibly civilian nuclear program. Parts of its program or parts of its activities are fully credibly civilian. It has a Bushehr nuclear power plant, that the Russians and parts of that other countries helped build, that the Russians are delivering nuclear fuel for. Um, so that part of Iran's nuclear program has not been questioned. Um, and the Bushehr nuclear power plant, for the most part, with some concerning exceptions recently, has not been targeted by Israel or by the US. Again, there were some instances more recently where it seems like there were attacks in the vicinity of the plant. But broadly speaking, that civil nuclear energy aspect of Iran's nuclear program has not come under scrutiny. So as long as states are in good standing with the agency and aren't engaging in things they shouldn't be, I don't see why it would pose any proliferation concern.
There is another layer here that goes beyond Iran specifically, and that's what this does to the broader rules around nuclear facilities.
At the same time, there have been concerns raised over the fact that the facilities that were attacked in Iran, or a number of the facilities that were attacked in Iran, were safeguarded facilities, right? So they were under IAEA safeguards. As I said, Iran has rolled back access to the IAEA quite extensively, but a number of the facilities that were attacked, as enrichment sites, for instance, were under IAEA safeguards, and they were still militarily targeted. So I think it's right to ask what lessons states will take away from that, that even facilities that are under IAEA safeguards aren't safe from military attack if an adversary decides that for whatever reason they see a concern over those facilities. So I think that that is something that we need to take into consideration around how do we reconstitute and strengthen this norm around well, first of all, not attacking civilian nuclear infrastructure, but in this case in particular, how do we navigate this norm around or strengthen or frankly maybe even develop it? I don't know how strong it really frankly has been around not targeting facilities that the International Atomic Energy Agency actually has visibility of and can provide credible technical information on what's actually happening in those sites. So that's something that I do think we need to have a serious think about.
If we look ahead, it seems the material damage to the program may already be significant, but that doesn't necessarily mean the risk is resolved. In fact, some of the biggest risks may now lie in how diplomacy and reconstruction unfold from here. Where do you see the most plausible pathway for this crisis becoming more dangerous than it already is?
No, I obviously don't know what the Trump administration or Israel might be planning, but I think the June attacks in particular, and a little bit the military action over the last couple of months have largely done the damage that I think one can do to Iran's nuclear program materially. I think any other military strikes against Iranian nuclear sites are you're sort of getting marginal benefit at this point. Um, what my biggest concern is moving forward, now that we've entered the phase where there's reports of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran on the nuclear question, my concern is that the Trump administration is going to be so eager to conclude an agreement, to say that, to claim victory, to open up the Strait of Hormuz, to say that the Trump administration has done a better job of negotiating a nuclear deal than the Obama administration had, um, that they end up and that they don't engage the necessary expertise in the administration, that they end up with an agreement with the Iranians, a nuclear deal that um, is unverifiable, that doesn't address the key concerns of the nuclear program. And Iran basically gets to walk away with a piece of paper that says, see, we've agreed to not enrich for 20 years, but nothing to verify it and nothing to address the capacity, their ability to enrich, after those 20 years. Um, and that with that, when the dust settles, when Iran has the time to reorganize itself, um, to reconstitute parts of the program away from international scrutiny, because the agreement's not included a thorough verification clause, um, and the U.S. administration thinks the nuclear question settled. When Iran has the time to figure out organizationally, who's responsible for the future of the nuclear program and what they want to do with it, that at that point the Iranians decide that, okay, we have both the incentive and the ability to quietly actually move past that threshold capability and move towards um, towards weaponization. Now, that I will caveat a little bit by the fact that the material reality on the ground is that the program, by all accounts, and we don't have a clear damage assessment yet, but by all accounts, has been quite heavily set back. So the Iranians will no doubt face material challenges in bringing the program to a point where it poses, an imminent proliferation concern very quickly. Um, but yeah, I think my concern is kind of what happens when we walk away from the negotiating table, and when the U.S. military goes home, if a proper diplomatic resolution that is verifiable, that is comprehensive, is not concluded.
What this conversation makes clear is that Iran cannot be understood through a single lens of capability or intent. It sits at the intersection of material capacity, strategic perception, and the limits of both cohesion and diplomacy. Across the discussion, a few tensions stood out. The first is that counterproliferation tools, whether military force, sanctions, or diplomacy, each address parts of the problem, but none fully resolve the underlying strategic logic driving hedging behavior. The second is that escalation in this case is not linear. It is shaped as much by interpretation and misinterpretation as it is by actual movement along a technical pathway. And the third is that latency itself has become politically meaningful, not as a transitional phase, but as a space where deterrence, ambiguity, and risk all coexist. Taken together, that raises a harder question: whether the current architecture of nuclear risk management is equipped for a world where capability is no longer binary and where perception may matter as much as possession. This has been the Nuclear Table. I'm Dr. Fleming Zhou. Until next time.